Well, good morning and welcome everybody. I'm Tanner Johnson and I'm going to be the moderator of today's session, which is entitled Shining a Light on Solar Energy, Opportunities at All Scales. And I think as you see from the materials, this is a really exciting opportunity to hear for some very smart folks that are in the middle of the policy discussions and the planning that's going around in Louisiana around solar. Our panelists today are going to discuss solar energy in Louisiana in the context of the energy transition, how communities can build resilience, create jobs and revenue, and overall how Louisiana can be a part of the progress as it relates to this renewable energy source. CPEX, of course, is at the forefront of this, and David will talk a lot about the Model SolarToolkit and the Model Ordinance that's been under development. So in a minute, I'm going to introduce these guys. One of our panelists needs no introduction, and a biography was not prepared, but I'll tease him a little bit in a second. I want to thank the sponsors of the conference and of this panel, and I want to make sure you know that if you are seeking or eligible for continuing education credits, they are available, so make sure you seek that out before you leave the session. So just a little bit about me, and then I'll get to these very esteemed panelists. I'm a native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm an attorney by education, and currently I'm working with a firm that's called Van Ness Feldman. And Van Ness Feldman has decades of experience in energy and environmental issues, and I really am just privileged to be a part of that group. My background, having worked in policy around coastal restoration and resilience, is a little bit of why maybe I was chosen to be a part of this group. But I'm somewhat new to the solar area, and really will lean on these guys for the subject matter. So from my left to right, your right to left, I want to introduce our panelists today. Lindsay Cooper is a policy advisor in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. Her policy work focuses on strategic interagency alignment, intergovernmental coordination, and federal outreach on state priorities regarding climate change, adaptation, and mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. Lindsay is also the manager, staffer, and primary author of Louisiana's 2022 Climate Action Plan. In previous roles, Lindsay has experience in both nonprofit work and academia, and focused on coastal conservation, floodplain management, and insurability. Broderick Baggert is here today, and I'm going to let him introduce himself when we come to him. Maybe he needs no introduction with this group. He's an organizer that's been a part of work here in Baton Rouge and now with Louisiana Together. Pierre Moses works as the president and leader of company operations at 127 Energy. Pierre has more than 15 years experience in clean energy finance and project development. His project expertise includes public and private portfolios of distributed generation assets and solar plus storage microgrids. Over the course of his career, Pierre has worked in multiple companies and foundations to source, underwrite, structure, and execute solar PV projects. And lastly, David Whitley is a Planning and Urban Design Manager at the Center for Planning Excellence. David has a background in urban planning, urban design, public policy, and development-related disciplines. He has over 20 years' experience in developing long-range plans and urban design strategies, drafting code amendments, planning and implementing capital projects, and managing economic development tools. So they've asked me to set a little bit of a stage, and I think it's going to be pretty rudimentary. So for those in the audience that are steeped in policy and the technology of solar as a power source, you will skip this part of the presentation. But for those that envision a single panel on a rooftop in your neighborhood, I'm your guy. I think the important stage setting here is that on all scales of solar, from an individual residence up to what we call utility scale solar, Louisiana is in dire need of planning, thoughtful policy development, and the kind of dialogue that we'll have today to understand where the obstacles are and where the opportunities lie to bring this power source as a renewable clean energy part of our portfolio. In the policy arena, there's, as is typical in Louisiana, a lot of different roads to go down. Many roads lead through the Public Service Commission, some through the Louisiana legislature, and some at the local level as it relates to the work on the model ordinance that David and others at CPEX are leading. So I think it's suffice to say this panel is going to cover all of that. One of the things that I reflect on, and will be a through line in each of these presentations and the discussion, is that solar energy as a source of power to provide for electricity at most of these levels is not a new technology. It's been around since the 1950s. Throughout the following decades, there are a couple things that sort of, as sort of laymen in the public, that we can note as driving the development of solar, and they mostly are two things: price and policy. And so what you'll see today is those two things have converged in the last few years. The price of solar has precipitously come down, by some measure since 1980, about 10% every year. So the affordability of solar, and then federal and state policy has recognized and seeks to incentivize solar at all of these scales and all these levels. So those two things are happening right now, and we've got some great panelists that are going to guide us through some of the opportunities and challenges in Louisiana. So I think I'm first going to turn it to Lindsay for a few bits of information.
Okay, let's see. There we go. Tanner, you skipped all your slides here. No worries. So thank you so much for the introduction, Tanner, and for having us on this panel. As Tanner mentioned, I'm with the governor's office, so I'll be kicking off this panel to level set on the state opportunities for solar, building on a lot of the foundational work that my team has done through developing the climate action plan over the past few years. So I'll talk about the different scale of barriers that they are, and then what one area is where the state's really taking leadership right now. So I'm going to kick it off here by talking about the progress that has been made on renewable generation. As Tanner mentioned, we are very far away from the ambitious goals of the climate plan, which set forth that we want to have 100% renewable generation by 2035, with 20% generated by clean sources as well. We also set goals for transmission increase, energy storage, offshore wind, and we are making progress towards this. Our utilities, the communities, our restaurants, even our commercial and industrial customers are all looking for alternative energy sources. So with all this momentum, we have assessed what is the lane for the state to take. As Tanner mentioned, there's a role for the Public Service Commission as a regulator, but more specific to the governor's office, what is our role in the energy transition and in reducing some of these barriers and in pioneering and leading our way to meeting the goals that we have set forward for the state of Louisiana in energy transition. And so in this, some of the big barriers that we face are around energy policy. We are very used to large generation projects that take 3 to 5 years to get permitted, and with smaller scale solar, they just don't quite fit into that same regulatory regime. And one of the other big barriers we face is that our power grid infrastructure, so the grid itself isn't prepared for or ready to take on all this infrastructure that is either at a small scale or a large scale because of a myriad of challenges that we face. So one of the big areas that we've been leading on in the governor's office is around strengthening this supportive grid infrastructure. Because again, we are not a regulator and we're partnering closely with the Utility Commission. But there are other areas where we have immediate needs as well. One of those is we can all commiserate on in this room. I know that each of us have experienced different hurricane impacts that have knocked out power, at least for hours, if not days, if not weeks. And we see this even through branches falling on our utility pole lines or a rainy day event. And one of the largest challenges we face, which is probably no surprise to anyone, is this legacy infrastructure we have in our power grid. So the infrastructure itself is over 100 years old, so it's aging out pretty quickly. So there's massive amounts of aging. The infrastructure also can't withstand these increased impacts from climate change. So for example, if we look on the graphic that I put up here, if there's a disruption anywhere from the production of fuel to the generation, like the power plant, to the transmission infrastructure, so the big lines that carry power across regions, and then distribution is the smaller lines within a region to the end user. If disruption happens anywhere along that chain, then there's no power. The power is knocked out. And with increased impacts from climate change, we see this more and more that we're facing disruptions at some scale of the process. And so that cuts out power always for the end user, and we're always on the end of it. An additional element that comes as we're thinking about our power grid and renewables is that the infrastructure we have creates a lot of barriers for renewables looking to come onto the power grid. It's challenging to integrate smaller scale energy sources when our grid is built for and very used to these huge fuel and power plant facilities that traditionally provide power. So we're having this transition of our grid that's first aging out and also struggling to grapple with these smaller sources. So the solution that we're addressing broadly, we've coined all of this under energy resilience. And this is part of a much broader conversation that has been happening really across the world as we've talked with other states and other nations in the same position. So the way that we in Louisiana have defined energy resilience is modernizing our power infrastructure system to withstand the stresses and shocks we face from extreme weather and large-scale disruptions. And our goals for resilience have to be balanced with having a safe, efficient, and affordable grid. So the outcome here is that we reduce frequency, duration, and impacts of outages. And this is very connected to how we deploy renewables, which is what I will get to. But before jumping in to how this connects to our solar conversation, to put this in perspective, the work that we're doing in Louisiana and even just in defining grid resilience, it's part of a broader initiative. In talking with states every day, everyone is grappling with this challenge, whether it be from wildfires, tornadoes, sandstorms, just increased energy uses from extreme heat or the extreme cold. We're seeing that our infrastructure is not adequate to withstand the impacts that we have from climate change and the impacts that we're seeing from increased solar and distributed generation. So DOE has actually set up an entire office to manage and support states in how we're addressing these grid challenges, and it's called the Grid Deployment Office. And their goal broadly is improving all hazard resilience and reducing outages of the grid. But we have to balance that goal of improving our resilience with also mitigating climate risk and modernizing grid assets, lowering energy costs, increasing electrification, increasing distributed energy, so like small scale, not huge fuel source projects, and then creating good paying jobs and prioritizing communities. So we need to hold all of these priorities at once, which especially in the energy sector are often combative and not always working in the same direction. But the federal government has backed up this priority of grid resilience through $14 billion in the Infrastructure Act and $125 billion that we'll see through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I show this slide here as a short breakdown of some of the different funding opportunities to demonstrate that the Department of Energy is thinking about this holistically. So they're not only thinking about hardening existing assets, but how we can deploy more solar and improve energy in rural areas and increase grid resilience and demonstrate a lot of different techniques and see what kind of works. And so we're really excited about that opportunity to pilot, to demonstrate, to show the success of different approaches to resilience of energy infrastructure. So with all of this opportunity on the table, Louisiana, we know that we can be a prime candidate for so much of the funding and the opportunities. We've had such a spotlight on us the past few hurricane season with the extensive outages, billions of dollars that have been spent on restoring energy infrastructure. So at the state level, we knew that we needed to put forward a united front in order to compete for this funding. And it's such a great incentive to encourage the state to build partnerships where we have not traditionally partnered together. And there's nothing better in state government than the promise of money, because state government never has any money. So we've taken this top-down mixed with a bottom-up approach as well. So no one actually has jurisdiction over grid assets. So when we're thinking about the power grid, strategic resilience and planning, you would think that that's the regulatory role, but it really isn't. for them based on the authority that they use. So we brought together the governor's office at the helm of this work, paired with our Public Service Commission, so the regulator of the utilities, the Division of Administration, so that's our budgetary office, our Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness that's helping us understand critical infrastructure, emergency response to hurricanes. A lot of these processes haven't been thought through in a long time, if ever, bringing them into the fold, as well as our state energy office. So we're bringing all these leaders in the state who touch on power to the conversation, and we've set them with a goal to really serve as our steering committee as we're looking at these federal funding opportunities and opportunities even beyond that to invest in our power grid, to invest in how the state is approaching transition. And their goal is to steer us as we develop near-term needs and long-term goals on how we're going to make grid improvements and enhance resilience in Louisiana. But we know that at the state level, we are not experts in the energy and utility space. And especially as we think about reimagining systems and thinking of power not as these huge power generation facilities, but as smaller generation that might be behind the meter and behind the distributed scale. So we've also paired this with doing roundtables with those who are energy users and energy providers. So we're meeting with our investor and utilities and the small utilities, the cooperatives, the municipal utilities, to ensure that the work that we're doing is grounded in what is most effective for them. We want to put forward applications, objectives, metrics that are attainable and effective for the challenges that are being faced on the ground so that we're helping them address some of those root challenges. And this has been really helpful for us as the state to level set and to enforce the way that we're approaching the objectives we have. Because we at a high level know the challenges, but hearing anecdotes from small utilities on the ground is incredibly effective for state leadership to understand. So one of the goals that we started at the beginning of this process, which really only kicked off about mid-year in the early summer, is we set out what our grid objectives were. So building aligned objectives across these different state entities. If you can imagine between all of the entities I mentioned on our interagency partnership, we have very different goals. So we had to set from the beginning of this process, what do we align on and what is our priority when we're focused on building out our grid improvements. And so we built this from existing state plans that we have. So these are around resilience, the environment, affordability, equity, and safety, bringing together a lot of goals the state has set through prior plans that we've done. And then this in turn, some of the graphics didn't transition right, but even so, you can see that these are the 5 high-level objectives that is guiding this interagency effort we have. So it's built on resilience, modernizing our infrastructure system, the environment, building a next-generation, sustainable, customer-centric, carbon-free grid, equity, affordability, and safety. And so with these objectives in mind, we've already applied for a formula program for the state level, which will be about $9 million a year. We're focusing that on microgrids as a convergence of these 5 objectives, because we're looking at projects that further all of the objectives we have. And Broad will talk more about what microgrids are. And we're also pursuing a $10.5 billion program right now. So we have a lot of different partners from the utility and the community space that are supporting us as we're considering how to go about some of these near-term funding opportunities. And with these objectives, we've actually entered into an interagency formal partnership through a memorandum of understanding. So the Public Service Commission, the Governor's Office, our Division of Administration, and the Energy Office, we're all in an MOU together that says that we're really going to lock arms. We're going to go after these funding opportunities that further our objectives and go beyond that as well. So use this really as a catalyst for future investment and engagement together as partners. So that will set a lot of the foundation for a lot of the work that's going on the ground, and a big role that only the state can fill, because our utilities are limited just to thinking through their jurisdiction. And even when they are doing some kind of resilience planning, it's not comprehensive across all of the assets that we have. So we're really excited about this work in Louisiana and know this is just the beginning of how we're going to catalyze solar deployment. And with that, I will pass it over to David.
Yeah, and I failed to say that I think that this panel has been structured really brilliantly as Lindsay just described, state policy. And what she just said is remarkable. This MOU between the state actors is not easy. And Lindsay and her colleagues have really championed that under the governor's leadership. So, and David's going to talk about driving policy and giving tools to the local level. And then Broderick will talk about how the community receives and brings sort of inputs to that. And then we'll get some sense from Pierre about the private industry. So failed to mention that. But David, now to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I hope y'all are able to attend part of the plenary this morning because one of the many pieces of this very complicated puzzle that they highlighted there was this kind of local land use planning and land use regulation piece. And what we were seeing with all of the opportunity and interest in solar and renewable development, as well as just the increased demand for it, was there was a hole there. The local communities weren't necessarily prepared to address the question of how to manage solar development, whether it be at the large utility scale or the community scale, or to some degree they're more prepared for the panels on the roof, but they really hadn't gone through kind of a process to really analyze their codes, their ordinances, and their plans to figure out if they knew what to do when the questions were asked. And so what we were seeing is around the state then, communities were being faced with this question and they were kind of having to build the airplane as they flew it. And that is a challenging position to be in, not just for the city or the parish and the community itself, but also for the solar developers, where you're kind of coming into a situation where you don't know the rules of the game and they're evolving as you're trying to negotiate this really big, complicated deal for the development of a facility. And then once you kind of agree on those terms, well, then you have to go through the process of approval. And so it was an inefficient mode. And so we felt like that's something we could sort of step in and address, that we could, sort of collect thoughts from people, have a really broad conversation, as well as do a lot of research and analysis, and develop a tool that could then serve as a bit of a go-by, so that communities could kind of have the resources to point to as they started to address this question. Now, what we also learned some very important things here through this process. We had a very multidisciplinary advisory committee that helped guide this. We developed a draft set of regulations, again, to serve as this framework that communities could use. And what we found really quickly is we hadn't actually fully addressed the question, that we needed to back up a little bit, because zoning in and of itself is not a long-range plan. And some of the questions were really more fundamental than just what kind of setback should it have? How big should a buffer, or should you even have a buffer? But they were really about how you integrate solar into the community. And so we sort of took a step back then, partway through the process, and had a much broader conversation. And we felt like, this really doesn't need to be a toolkit that's just about rules. It really needs to be a toolkit about process and about conversation and how we sort of bring all the sides together in the development of a more proactive approach to preparing your community for renewables. And so what came out of that, before I get to that, and so this toolkit in and of itself, is set to serve two big functions. One, to appropriately set the table, to make sure that all the voices that are part of the conversation are there and can be heard, because it's important to have a balanced and implementable set of regulations. And if you aren't looking at it from all perspectives, well, you're not going to end up with a really usable tool, right? And then the second piece, again, was the idea that we would have this resource, but it's not something that's just going to have come down from the mountain. There would be sort of prompts and questions that the community should go through in order to figure out, well, how best to calibrate these ideas to their specific needs and to the specific concerns of their community, as well as sort of the specific demands they were seeing as far as the need for solar and renewable development, regardless of the scale that it's at. Now, a lot of the conversation, however, naturally gravitated towards these utility scale solar developments, because that was, again, a lot of the key questions and pressing issues that the communities were facing were in that space. And so part of this sort of pivot and revisit was for us to step back and make sure that we fully understood what that development process looked like if you were going through it. But we also felt like communities needed to understand that as well. And so, it really, you mentioned it's about a 3 to 5 year process. Well, that's actually then broken down into kind of even further subset of processes where kind of the level of certainty on a solar development site moving forward sort of increases over time, because there's a whole lot of due diligence, a whole lot of analysis, a whole lot of conversation that goes into planning one of these facilities. And so on the early end, it's really kind of about that, what's the universe of possibilities, and how do they select sites so that a community could understand, well, not all my land might even be appropriate, at least given today's technology, for this type of development. So where do I need to focus my effort and energy on planning for solar development? And then as you get a little further into the process, it starts to then weigh in the financials and all of that, and you start to get a little more direct connection between the local community need, the local community requirements, as well as the developer's process. So starting to figure out where we could best bridge the kind of community planning side of this with the solar development side of this. And then ultimately at the end, then it's that sort of really direct conversation where you're working with the community to understand how best to address some of the site issues specific to that development. And sort of on the flip side of this then is then helping the communities to understand, how do you then go about preparing yourself for this? Don't wait for the conversation to come to you, but really sort of get out there and have a proactive, long-range planning conversation like we do with all kinds of things, specific to the integration of renewables. Because one of the key challenges that we were hearing back from the communities is they were concerned about sort of the sort of consumption of land. And that's a threat that's not just about solar, it's about all kinds of development, right? You should be having those conversations about where you want to direct growth and how you want to manage that. And it's no different here. The other pieces of the puzzle are also around, how do you sort of integrate this into your other environmental goals, your other aesthetic goals, the other sort of community values that you have. But again, there's a theme here. You don't just isolate solar. You should be having those conversations about all kinds of development, and you should have a consistent approach to them as well. And so the end result, which we are getting very near to completing, is much broader than just a toolkit of model regulations. But like I said, it's really more about a process and a list of questions and considerations that communities need to go through so that they can begin to prepare and start to work with the solar developers before they have an immediate development question that they're having to address. Because again, like I said, that is a less than ideal way to address this issue. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, then, what they can do through this process is not just address sort of the solar development needs as far as site placement and the like, but it's really about also looking at it from the perspective of equity and resilience, and making sure that they're thinking about this in the perspective of those goals as well as their own climate goals. And how are we going to utilize this renewable resource in order to develop those, and how can you prepare your community so that you're actually equipped to do those types of things. And so, like I said, we're anticipating this toolkit will be out the first quarter of next year. It's kind of morphed into a much more comprehensive document, which we think is a good thing, because it really provokes deeper question and deeper conversation at the community level before you kind of even get into those detailed questions about siting and development and the like. So with that.
Awesome. And David, you guys did a fantastic job. I might have messed this up. We're running about 10 minutes late. I already have tons of questions, which I'm holding, and I hope you all have some too. So just brought up to you, and we'll make sure we get on track with time.
So my name is Broderick Baggert. I'm an organizer with Together New Orleans and Together Louisiana. Those are organizations made up of existing organizations. So I have to catch up 10 minutes with I'm gonna do my best. Let me ask you to start. Pretend like that green table is your neighborhood, okay, where you live. And if you live in a city, then it's about a half-mile area. If you live in a rural area, it's about 3 to 5 miles, okay? and there's a big storm, power goes out, think of the place in your community where they're going to have food, ice, portable batteries that you can pick up to get your cell phone charged and then return, the next day and get a charged one, and where volunteers are going to know everybody who lives in that area who's dependent. Their life is dependent on a power dependent medical device or is vulnerable in some other way. And in the first 24 hours, we'll canvass, right? And check in on people. Is it a church? Is it a school? Is it a community facility? Literally think of the name of that facility in your community that's going to have electricity because it's going to have solar panels and it's going to have a big backup battery system that's not going to kill anybody because of carbon monoxide, because there's no carbon monoxide involved. I want to structure my remarks about 3 very quick anecdotes about my 10-year-old son. One, the week he was born, the second 3 months ago, and the third was this morning. He was born on August 21st, 2012. That was the week of Hurricane Isaac, which you'd have no reason to know. It wasn't that memorable of a storm. For us, it was memorable because he was jaundiced, which is no big deal. It's, you need light to trigger bilirubin, but when it's your first child and your kid's orange, it freaks you out. So he was jaundiced enough to where they needed to hospitalize him, except Hurricane Isaac was in the Gulf, and they didn't want to hospitalize him because you just don't want to be in a bad situation. So they sent this big light bed, and we started putting him under it. That was 2 days before the storm. He was starting to get a little bit better. Light beds famously require electricity, okay? And it was, the eye came right over New Orleans, power goes out. Now we're shuttling around the neighborhood with a light bed under my arm and a 6-day-old child under my wife's arm looking for somebody with a generator in the neighborhood, which we found. And the whole thing was kind of just bizarre enough to sort of be like a wild experience. After Hurricane Ida, 29 people died. 27 of them died because of the failure of the electricity grid. That's become the norm. It's not flying debris and storm surges that are killing people. It's carbon monoxide and failures of people's health because of extreme heat night after night after night. A few days after Hurricane Ida, I was displaced to Mississippi, like everybody we know. Didn't hit New Orleans. New Orleans got 55-mile-an-hour winds, but it knocked out the transmission system. That chart's great. Which meant all the power went out. We all know this. So the leaders of initially Together New Orleans, who are pastors and community leaders who are now scattered all over the place, we've spent 5 years building this whole organization to be able to do things when the community needs it, and they can't do anything, and they feel utterly powerless and incapable to respond. And as Pastor Antoine Barrier put it, we decided to stop asking when are they going to do X, Y, Z, and start saying, how are we going to do X, Y, Z? And started meeting with everybody we could think of. That's how we met Pierre, that's how we met Lindsay, about how can we be better respond. And the answer we came up with is we need commercial scale solar, not just here or there, but on a really big network of community institutions. The goal in New Orleans is nobody lives further than a half mile from a facility that has commercial scale solar and a big backup battery system. And as we started developing this idea, we realized the timing was really good. There was this federal money that was coming down for ideas just such as this. The need to transition our entire economy to be A, to electrify it, and B, to decarbonize it. Both of these fit within this goal. So this idea really takes root. And we've just launched a first phase, which is going to have 16 locations in New Orleans and another 8 across the state, one at the McKinley Alumni Center here. And Pierre says that after that first phase, this will be the largest grid-independent network of resilience hubs in the world, which sounds really impressive to me, although it may also say we're not very far along in this project. If this is, if we're... So the second story about my son is 3 months ago. He's learning about climate change and kind of the imminent catastrophe and the needs to electrify everything and decarbonize everything. And he says, you know, I just can't imagine Louisiana ever doing this. I can't imagine it. And if that's where he's at, and I mean, not to be, and he's my kid, and we're doing it on the bigger scale than we're in trouble. I started talking to him about his school and being a community. The third story is I just got back from a conference for 3 days in Phoenix last night, and he had something he wanted to tell me. He was very excited about it, and I tried to make his wife spill the beans. I mean, my wife, his mom, spill the beans, and she wouldn't. And so this morning he woke up and he said, "What I want to tell you is I'm doing my cumulative exhibition." He goes to an international baccalaureate public school that a bunch of neighbors helped to start. He said, my final project, which is going to be in the spring, I want to do it on our electricity system and solar panels and batteries. This project is about resilience, but it's also about having a network of institutions across the state who know that we can do this because their facilities did it. And they did it in a way that did not cost them a lot of money. In fact, it saved them money. That makes them net zero facilities. It will displace all of their electricity usage. This makes it more convenient, not less. This notion that is going to be this huge expense and massive inconvenience to give up the fossil fuel economy and move to, it is an outdated notion. This is better technology. It is, we think this is going to be a really good thing for resilience. Part of what's got us so excited about it is finally, from a really on-the-ground community organizing perspective, we think this can be a way that local people can stop pretending like planting trees and recycling alone is going to get there, right? And start engaging in a really serious way about how they can be a part of driving forward the policies, the practices, the on-the-ground realities that we need to make this energy transition a reality. Thanks. Pierre has taken that very vague and fantastical vision and turned it into kilowatt hours and battery pies. So when we found Pierre and knew what he was capable of, he's become a huge part of making that happen. So we'll let him finish off our remarks today.
Thank you, Broad. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pierre Moses. I'm the president of a solar and battery storage development and project finance company. And as Broad mentioned, I'm typically tasked with executing these visions, right? So we take projects from a circle on a map to actual commercial operation and long-term power production. I think the sense you've gotten so far today is that resiliency means different things to different people. It means different things to different scales of our built environment. One reason why we're talking about solar as generation rather than wind or biomass or some other zero carbon power production is because solar is boring. And that's kind of why it's awesome. Yeah, I assure you that green hydrogen people and carbon capture people would love to be called boring, but they're not. Solar is boring for a key reason, because it kind of just works. It's reliable. Sure, it's not producing power, during nighttime hours, but we know that, and you can account for that. It's predictable. So the boring aspect of solar is what allows it to be deployed with a high degree of confidence that it's going to do what we say it's going to do. There isn't much variability. There aren't a lot of moving parts, right? So when you think about it from a maintenance perspective, maybe just utility scale solar with single axis trackers, those are like the only moving parts in the entire system. The dirty little secret, just not much of a secret, of large-scale solar farms is that there aren't a lot of jobs after the projects are built. And that's a downside, right? It's not that you spend all this money, you build all this power production, but where are the long-term jobs? And the reality is these things don't take much effort to operate, right? There's minimal maintenance, there aren't many moving parts, and so they're predictable, they're reliable. And thinking about these different segments, the scales of solar, how does this technology apply to different people, different industries, different situations, different communities? The good news about solar, again, it's boring, it's simple, it's virtually the same technology to power a doghouse in your backyard, if your doghouse needed power, as it is to deploy, virtually the same solar panel is deployed in a utility scale solar farm. And so this slide gives you some sense of this technology can be scaled up or scaled down as needed. There's one policy I did want to highlight, which is community solar. And David mentioned community solar. Community solar is a really important policy that should be deployed in every regulatory environment across the country. It's available in a lot of places. It's not available in Louisiana. There is a version of community solar that's available in New Orleans, but it's not very accessible, and we're working on those improvements. The point is, community solar is really the only policy that really has the opportunity to engage low, middle income account holders in this energy transition. The idea that every single building needs to have its own power source is inefficient. There should be this kind of hybrid solution where you have larger scale projects, call it 5 megawatts per site, but you're still supplying and offering a retail value proposition to account holders. And that's what community solar achieves. And as you can imagine, all of these various scales could be coupled with battery storage, right? Battery storage solves a lot of those inherent constraints that solar has on its own. People refer to battery storage as the new bacon because it makes everything better. And right, you have intermittency issues. Oh, what if you have storage? You have time of use rates where power is really cheap during the day and expensive in the evening. Well, when you have batteries, you can shift that discharge profile to later hours in the day. So are all of these sort of optimization opportunities that really come into play once you add battery storage to the mix. As Broad mentioned, this resiliency movement, right? We are so clearly not even in the first inning of that game. I mean, this is a 50-unit apartment building in New Orleans that SPP built. It is Louisiana's first clean energy microgrid. Sure, you could consider a generator that's powered by methane a microgrid, but we're talking about a zero emissions microgrid. One that is not, how should I say this, a paperweight waiting for the next storm to occur. This is a microgrid that actually pays for itself day in, day out. You have rooftop solar, and the only kind of interesting component, that little white box on the grass on the side of the page, is the battery enclosure. And this system allowed SPP's tenants to have power supply during Ida. This was up and operating during Ida last year. This project is only 2 years old. Now, sure, we're going to build a lot of community lighthouses with Together New Orleans, and there are other resiliency projects going in, but we are in the early stages of building out grid resilience from the inside out. And I think that's important to note. Utility scale power production, including wind and solar, is important, but it's still vulnerable to the same distribution and transmission line failures that we've experienced in the past. If you don't have on-site resilience, then you are just as susceptible as traditional power production disruptions. But you don't have the same safety, concerns that from carbon monoxide from generators, and you certainly don't have the same exposure to supply chain constraints like having to get gas for a generator during a power outage. So let's get down to some brass tacks. What do these systems cost? How much space do they need? Again, these are scalable, modular solutions, so you can imagine these numbers and sizes can be scaled up and scaled down. This is taking just sort of a middle-of-the-road solar plus storage project. So you have a rooftop solar project, maybe 150 kW, $1.90 per watt. That'll cost you $285,000. You have an integrated battery storage system, 220 kilowatt hours of batteries would be the size of that battery storage system. $1,100 per kilowatt hour, that's a pretty high number, but that's an all-in cost. So that assumes, sort of turnkey installation. You're looking at about $525,000 of total project CapEx. Now, sure, that's a healthy sticker price for a commercial scale investment, but as you're well aware, there are ways to support that cost. There are subsidies available. I'll get to those in just 1 minute. Some of the smaller projects, but still on a commercial scale, I think you could get down to about $150,000. Once you go below that level of capital expenditure, you're probably in a more residential setting. In terms of project siting, a rooftop will need 90-ish, 90 to 100 square feet per kW installed. And then if you're looking at a ground mount where you have single axis trackers, you need a little bit more space in between the rows to avoid shading. You would need roughly 5 acres per megawatt to get a system installed. So again, thinking about David's toolkit, if you're a municipality and you're thinking large scale solar, that gives you some sense of how much space you require. So back to that sticker shock. I would say more than anything, the Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer. I mean, for those that have been in this industry for a long time, you hear some version of, this is the one we've been waiting for. This is transformational federal policy that has a wide range of things in it. I'm just going to talk about something that's pertinent to this discussion today. The incentives are in place through 2032, the vast majority of them that apply to solar, so there is no immediate cliff. B, the base credit is 30%, yet for the first time ever, there are adders that can be stacked on top of that 30%. If the project is located in an energy community, and it is likely the vast majority of Louisiana will qualify as an energy community based on these specific economic criteria, you get an additional 10%. If you're located in a low-income census tract, which a lot of census tracts in Louisiana will qualify for, you get an additional 10%. If you use U.S.-made gear, you get an additional 10%, but I think U.S.-made gear is going to be sold out for several years now, so I wouldn't bank on that. The point is you can build that ITC, that investment tax credit, up to about 50%. So that starts to take the pressure off and mitigate that sticker shock of $500,000 investment for a commercial building. For the first time ever, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, levels the playing field for nonprofits and tax-exempt project owners. Those types of project owners can get cash rebates in lieu of a tax credit. So you take a municipality or a nonprofit or any type of tax-exempt organization, they make this investment, they'll get a federal cash rebate as opposed to having to deal with a messy tax credit, which has been hard to monetize in the past. There are also depreciation benefits, and just last comment, I'm not even mentioning the fact that there are energy savings that come from investing in these projects. I'm also not mentioning the fact that there's a value to resiliency. Valuing resiliency is not an easy number to put into a pro forma and justify some upfront investment, but I assure you, if you take the time to come up with a value for resiliency for your community or your project, it is not an insignificant number. So there are lots of ways to justify these investments. Simply said, there aren't many excuses anymore. I think at this point, communities have all the tools and resources they need to make these investments a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to quickly challenge our panelists to a lightning round question, and then I'm going to open up the floor, and I'm going to channel Broderick's son a little bit. I presume the story in the vignette is that he's a little more optimistic. He's taken the challenge on for the project, but let's go back to the earlier version of your son, a little bit pessimistic. So I'm going to ask, all of this to me says, why won't we, in whatever reasonable amount of time, be a leading state in solar in this aspect of energy transition? So lightning round for each of you. When you think about your role from the state, local, private, and community level, what is the number one challenge or obstacle to getting this done? Because it seems like some of the policies are lining up, some of the funding is lining up, but you identify, and we've got only about 10 minutes left, the single greatest challenge to a positive vision of this.
Single greatest is a challenge, Tanner. I could think of a couple. One of the predominant ones from the state side is education and working with communities on understanding the benefits, opportunities, and how to go about solar since it is a new technology. It's also met with a lot of resistance in Louisiana, which is a very traditional oil and gas state. And we very much have cultural identity that's tied to that. So being able to broaden our understanding of being an energy state and working with communities just on those behavioral changes is really paramount.
My answer's somewhat similar, but a slightly different take on it. Understanding, I think there's a lot of myths out there about solar and its impacts, and so I think educating the community on, how do these things really operate, and that, they're quiet, they don't do a whole lot, they just kind of sit there, and there's not a lot to feel threatened about necessarily, and if you think it through and sort of fold in your community values, it's fine. So I think it's that myth busting on some of the things that are out there.
I'm going to cheat and do two, but they're going to be fast. One is upfront bridge loans to get to the federal subsidies on the back end for nonprofits at a significant enough scale to, it's not even finance, just sort of allow those subsidies to also be upfront capital. And just construction and project development capacity that is interested in and in relationship with community. And I think we need to build that, but also to hire it, because we could be doing things at 10 times the scale right now if the know-how was sort of there at that scale as well.
Before Pierre answers it, Broad, the Inflation Reduction Act also has a significant amount of funding on financing through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $7 billion. It's envisioned some of that may go to local green banks that could provide that kind of financing.
And so we need local green banks.
Yeah, that's right. Access to financing, and I think Broad's description of it as a bridge, that's exactly right. The money has to come from somewhere up front, but there isn't that long of a lag before the IRA kind of back-end incentives come back. But we do have to have access to financing, and we just have to have more integration of these types of technologies into our architectural, engineering, zoning, right? That's why I love this toolkit, is because it's embedding these concepts in the kind of foundational vision of how we expand and develop from the ground up. So if we're not coming close to a mandate of these types of technologies on new construction, we're missing the mark.
And before I turn it over to the floor for a few questions, I would say, in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges is the regulatory regime in Louisiana. New Orleans is somewhat lucky that the city council has noted itself more progressive, and they regulate the utility for New Orleans. We have municipal energy providers that are not regulated, and we have some co-ops that have forged out in some really progressive ways, but the large amount of the power that's provided specifically to the industrial corridor and other important assets within the state are regulated by the Public Service Commission. And with all due respect to the commission, this is new for them too. And they are 100-plus-year-old institution that's governed solely by a single provision in the state's constitution, with little to no oversight by the state legislature, little to no funding at all from the general treasury. They operate on their own, and I think the education, outreach, and influence needs to touch them in a way that's probably historic for them. So, and that's why I noted and applaud the governor's office for making some of those pathways and partnerships. So with a limited time left, a couple minutes, I would welcome thoughts from the floor.
Yeah, it occurs to me a lot of the new development that we see in the Baton Rouge area are residential subdivisions. You talk about the value of a community program. Would a new subdivision be an appropriate community, i.e. could the developer develop that in such a way that it has its own self-contained solar energy? And are there any examples that you know of that have already been done that way?
There's certainly no technology constraint there. So it's a exercise of understanding if we have a grid-tied microgrid. I think that's important to distinguish. If you're still connected to the public utility grid, but maybe your primary power source is solar and batteries, I think that's a palatable structure from a community standpoint. There are some communities, in particular in California, where there are new developments and the cost to bring new utility lines there is so expensive, they're going to exclusively deploy solar and batteries and not have a traditional utility connection. That's a little bit different. In our region, I think having a grid-tied microgrid, it's not only advisable. I think it's really advantageous from both a development standpoint and would be attractive from from homeowners or renters.
And then the follow-on answer is whose transmissions lines are next to this developer, how the developer builds in his or her cost for that facility as it relates to the regulatory steps you'd have to go through. And there are today some barriers to implementing a project of that type if it were regulated by the Public Service Commission of Louisiana. Boo Thomas at the front table.
I'm so impressed by the MOU that you've signed, and so I'm terrified that once there is a different administration, does that MOU, is it protected or does it go away?
So the MOU, and that's such a great question, Boo. The MOU goes through the end of 2024 as we have the partnership now. The value in creating that partnership is that it has longevity beyond the administration. So whereas before we were solely leading in the governor's office on an island almost, and we were really struggling to pull along the other agencies, now the continuation of the Public Service Commission and the State Energy Office, they aren't subject to administration changes like I am in the governor's office. So they will be able to continue carrying on the mission that we have started now. So our goal here is to catalyze them to become leaders in this space so that even when administrations change, there's already momentum. We've broken down a lot of the barriers and they're still going to keep going strong.
Hey, Matt Thornton with T. Baker Smith. The last couple years has been pretty wild between West Feliciana, East Feliciana, St. Helena, along the main transmission tower corridors of these developers coming in and, outbidding each other, just like in the 90s for oil and gas lease sites, getting them under contract. You mentioned earlier it's a 2 to 5 year process. After the due diligence period of wetland, environmental, sunlight evaluations, whatever that is, what's the simplified process that they go through for the tax credits to get these constructed? And then on the other end of that, these guys that are kind of ahead of the game, are they held to this toolkit design criteria as well, or are they kind of up front and cowboying?
Well, I can address the toolkit piece, not so much the tax credit, so I'll let that be fielded somewhere else. So the toolkit that we're developing is completely informational. It's up to the communities then to come in, take that, and then integrate it into their regulations. And so it would be kind of anything then that is developed in that community under those rules would be what those tools would apply to once they come into the development process. Land acquisition wouldn't necessarily trigger one way or the other. It's really about at the time of development what the rules are when they have to apply those. And it would vary by community.
Yeah, on the tax credit front, traditionally the project owner, that developer that's coming in, will take that tax credit and monetize it one way or the other. Typically have a tax equity investor in their ownership group that takes and makes use of that tax credit. With the IRA, again, if you're a nonprofit, you could get a cash rebate. But even if you're a for-profit and you can't use that tax credit, you can sell that tax credit for cash, which is, again, a brand new provision in the IRA. So I would argue that going forward, municipalities shouldn't just assume that the only way to do these types of projects is to execute a power purchase agreement with a large developer. They should look at having more ownership and more, direct equity in their own projects. Even though it takes a little bit more work on the front end, I think it'll pay major economic dividends down the road in terms of, what the overall value proposition is to those projects. Development it's a needed function, but the IRA has provided some new opportunities that didn't exist previously.
One more question in the back.
Okay, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but solar, I'm all for solar. You talked about, I want to carry on your metaphor of batteries to bacon. Talk about basically the healthiness of them. I think that's the actual dirty secret about solar and batteries is how do we get the materials to create batteries? And I think that I think it's more important to be transparent about the realities of how dirty the process is to get batteries, and I think instead of brushing it under the rug and letting the oil and gas components say, yeah, but they use batteries and life cycle costs wise, strip mining is way worse than any kind of fracking when it comes to environmental impacts. Are there any technologies that we can take a more head-on approach to cleaning up that process? Is there anything in the battery EV solar industry? Are there people that are looking at ways to clean up the battery making process? Or if there is policy being drafted to say, like we put restrictions on, not buying from people that use forced child labor or something. Is there a way to put policy in effect to clean up that dirty underside, that underbelly of batteries?
On the battery mining and raw materials side, it's a messy topic, and it's being hashed out in markets and communities around the world. Certainly, there are extraction, impacts of getting these raw materials. The industry is trying to grow up as quickly as they can, trying to stop using cobalt that's almost exclusively mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo and has nasty labor practices. So using technologies like Tesla has shifted entirely to LFP batteries. Those are lithium ferrous phosphate batteries that don't use cobalt for that exact reason. So there are incremental, I guess you could say, improvements in the overall supply chain and raw material gathering for batteries, but I think it's safe to say there is an incredible amount of innovation happening on the R&D front within battery storage broadly. Battery storage is a really expansive space, right? There's a lot of chemistries. There's long duration battery storage tech that is wildly different than the lithium ion we're talking about for these, kind of commercial scale resiliency projects. So I would say, to some degree, be patient and keep researching, because it's going to be a quickly evolving space for the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Pierre. Well, thanks everybody for attending the panel and for some of those questions. And thank you to our panelists and sponsors. I'd invite everyone now to grab your lunch and convene in the auditorium, the atrium for the plenary. Thank you.